Uh, Hi everyone, welcome back to First to 13, a podcast about all things Celeste Bingo. I'm Lead, and today I'm joined by my co-host Crab. As always, First to 13 is available on YouTube and Spotify with links in the description.
Yeah, so today we mostly want to talk about getting into bingo, especially for people who have never seen or played bingo ever before. Um, Although going into this, we are going to assume that you have at least some experience with Celeste in general and Celeste speedrunning.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
just as a little bit of introduction, Celeste Bingo is, in my admittedly biased opinion, possibly one of the best speed games for bingo out there. There's a lot of thought and intense routing and super cool decision making that happens all the time when you're playing. I know that players can attest that it's an incredibly exciting and thrilling experience. I know watchers can attest that it's an incredible experience. So if you're looking to get into bingo, Celeste is a good game to start.
Yeah, and the thing about Lockout Bingo is that it's a strategy game more than a speed game, or not more than, I should say equally as much a strategy game and a speed game, which is not really something you get anywhere else in Celeste because play game fast or play game hard, but you really need to route against your opponent, which makes for some big brain stuff.
Yeah, it's absolutely a game of not just physical speed, but also mental capacity. And we've seen both of those come into play at all skill levels of bingo. Believe me, like even at the expert level, how fast you are doesn't matter as much as how well you out and how good you are at leading your opponent and playing mind games. Honestly,
Yeah. So with that being said, we are going to assume that you, as a listener, have a baseline of knowledge about Celeste, the collectibles, and the speed tech. So we won't be explaining it here.
yeah. So if you do want to learn about those sorts of things, feel free to, well, if you don't have Celeste, get Celeste for yourself, or check out the Celeste Discord. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
great place.
tons of great resources there. So
Mm-hmm.
moving on to the goods. um,
Yes.
Obviously, the first thing that you need to get started with bingo is uh, your equipment. What are you going to use? So, aside from Vanilla Celeste, most bingo players, and by most I mean 99% of bingo players, use modded Celeste, so Everest, because there are some pretty helpful mods that we use. Bingo UI has counters for things like keys and actually not keys. That's the one collectible that's not in Bingo
Yeah.
UI. But Oshiro stuns, snowball bops, um, like lots of counters that are pretty important. Um,
Yeah. It's essentially a mod that adds an on-screen indicator for all those pesky things that are too difficult to count on your own, and so you just have a counter for them. Every
yeah,
time you bop Oshiro, every time you grab a berry, it'll count it for you, which is super useful. And so, again, 99% of bingo players more or less use Bingo UI. So if you're looking to get started into bingo, highly recommend it.
yeah. We also use a website called Bingo Sync. That is where the boards are played. It's basically an online website that creates bingo rooms with your bingo board that you can use to play by yourself or with your opponents. Um,
Yeah, it's super intuitive and easy to work with. You put in you pick your speed game, you put in a name, you put in a password. Sometimes you input a custom generator. You get your friend to join the bingo sync room, and then you just tick off objectives.
yep,
And yeah, it's as simple as that.
yeah. There's really no entry bar to playing Lockout Bingo for any game, including Celeste. If you want to just try it out, stop the podcast and go try it, really, everything that we're going to be saying in this podcast is helpful but not necessary.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And so when So the thing about playing with Bingo Sync, of course, Bingo Sync being an external website, you're going to need to see it as you play Bingo. So if you've got 2 monitors, or if you don't want to play in full screen, those are both options for being able to both see the bingo board and see the game as you play. But if you don't want to do either of those two, there's actually another option for you. An incredibly useful mod called Bingo Clients. Credit to Lomot for creating it. Not all bingo players use it, but a handful of them do. What it essentially does is it overlays a copy of the bingo board into your Celeste game so that you can see the bingo board as you play. And a lot of players use it both into, like, it's completely tournament legal. You can use it wherever you want. And a lot of players say that it really helps them. A lot of players, especially with one monitor, say it really helps them categorize the board as they play. So, yeah, definitely not a requirement, especially if you have 2 monitors. But if you want to check it out, please do so.
Yeah, and if you ever need help getting this stuff set up, feel free to hit up the Celeste community events Discord, also known as the Bingo Court. Links in the description for that as well.
Yeah. So that's pretty much the core equipment that you'll need for bingo. It should also be said, I guess, that if you ever want to play blackout bingo, which is a variant of bingo, we'll talk about in a bit. And you want to play with a group of friends or something, you can always get CelesteNet, which is a sort of independent. Well, it's independent from bingo, but it's basically just a mod that's created so that you can play with your friends and make Celeste sort of multiplayer. You can see your friends, interact with them if you want to, play bingo with them. It's great. You can absolutely use it.
Yeah. It is worth mentioning, though, that CelesteNet is not usually used for Lockout for reasons we will also explain in a bit.
Yep.
So, Lockout. Lockout is the main rule set for Celeste Bingo. It's the rule set that we most often use for Bingo. And if you are confused by anyone saying Lockout, fear not, because I'm going to go over it right now. The most important thing, and the thing that a lot of people get confused by, is Lockout Bingo is not first to get a line. And I know the name is pretty confusing, with, it's bingo, classic bingo,
Yeah.
with the number rolly thing is first to get a line. We don't really do that here.
Yeah, so the way that the lockout rule set works, 2 players start the game, they open up a board of 25 objectives, and instead of looking to get a line, they're looking to get a majority of the objectives, which, if you do the math, a majority out of 25, that's going to be 13. And so the goal of Lockout Bingo is to be the first one to get 13 objectives.
Wow, it's like our name.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, the reason it's called Lockout Bingo, if you haven't heard, is that 2 players can't get the same objective. If you complete an objective in the Celeste video game and you take it off, then your opponent can't take it off anymore. And so Lockout lends itself to some really interesting gameplay where the easy stuff gets ticked off first, and then as the game goes on, objectives get sparser. It becomes pretty difficult to get to that 13 number. So
yeah.
It definitely makes for some interesting rules.
Yeah.
Lockout, of course, is a 1 versus 1 game mode. I should have mentioned that at the start, but yeah, 2 players up against each other.
Yep. And the main really important thing, well, not the main thing, but one of the main things that contribute to strategy in Lockout is that when you tick off, or when you complete an objective in the game, you're not required to tick it off right away. So you can hide information doing that. For example, if you have an objective that's like, oh, I don't know, collect 10 berries, and you get your 10th berry, you don't need to tick that off yet. You can tick it off at your leisure.
Yep. Players, of course, aren't allowed to see each other's gameplay. The only information that they get about where their opponent is from those ticks. So you can use those. So you can use when you tick off objectives as sort of a resource in order to hide information or all sorts of things, which I think we'll briefly brush over later.
Which is why we don't use CelesteNet.
Yep, exactly. I mean, CelesteNet has a feature that allows you to see where the other players are. That would probably be a problem in Lockout.
Yeah. And so, aside from Lockout, there are a few other game modes that Celeste bingo is good for. There is blackout, which is first to 25 objectives. Obviously, no lockouts there. And there's also 3-line, which is first to get 3 lines. Also pretty self-explanatory. Neither of which are as popular as lockout, although blackout is pretty good, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's usually a good way to practice, or just to hang out with friends. Blackout is oftentimes a team thing.
Yep.
Lockout, of course, being 1v1, you can't talk with anyone. If you ever feel like playing Celeste Bingo with your friends, I recommend just jumping into a voice call, loading up a blackout board, and just playing to 25 objectives.
Yep.
Cooperatively.
Yeah, it's
So,
great
yeah.
practice. It's good fun.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And so, with that being said, I guess we can talk a little bit about how Lockout works specifically with regards to Celeste.
Yeah, so the main difference between Celeste in Bingo and like vanilla Celeste is we have custom progression in place. And the custom progression is really important to the game, which is a great reason to have Bingo UI, because it kind of changes the linear nature of Celeste into a much more flexible way of playing. And so I'm going to quickly run over it here. It's not super important to retain all of it, but first thing is that when you complete Temple, instead of just unlocking Reflection, you also unlock Summit. So to get to Summit, you don't need to play Reflection, which is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, players more or less got tired of playing a 6-minute chapter that didn't have a lot of objectives, and so someone was like, hey, why don't we just make this chapter optional? And then it happened.
Yep.
So yeah, chapter 6 is now optional.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, in addition to that, the late game chapters after chapter 7, they take forever, so we have unique ways of unlocking them early too. Core 8A is unlocked from the start, but you need 4 cluster hertz in order to enter it, and you probably won't get those until you play a little bit of the game.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, there's several different ways to get those hearts, but it's not like you can just hop into core straight from. I mean, you can, but you won't be able to do anything in it.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you can grab red hearts from completing B sides, or blue hearts from finding the secret blue hearts in A sides. But yeah.
Yeah. In addition to that, reaching farewell, you don't need to beat core for that. That would suck. Instead. Yeah. You unlock farewell after completing chapter 4, the Golden Rage.
Mm-hmm. And then there's one other thing, which is actually a clue in vanilla Celeste and is sometimes used in speedrunning.
Often.
Often used in speedrunning. It turns out that due to a slight oversight by the devs, completing the B side of a chapter without completing the A side unlocks the following chapter. So if instead of completing Temple A, you grab the cassette and complete Temple B, you can unlock Chapter 6.
And
you
Summit.
Can unlock Reflection. Yeah, and Summit in Bingo. So that's actually an exploit that's used in speedrunners of the base game, since sometimes that's actually faster. But it also lends itself to a sort of interesting... It also lends itself to sort of interesting routing in Bingo, because usually taking the B-side path takes longer, but it can also sometimes get you more objectives. There's a great back and forth there.
Yeah. And finally, the most important part of our custom progression is you get 1 assist skip that you're allowed to use throughout the game. So if there's not a lot of objectives in, for example, chapter 3, and you don't want to play it, you can skip it. That's your 1 skip. You don't get another one, but you are able to enter Golden Ridge without doing the resort, which is the main thing that differentiates routes from each other and differentiates games from each other, so the whole thing doesn't get stale.
Yep, you can skip chapter 1. Well, you probably shouldn't skip chapter 1 considering it's very short.
But you can.
But you can skip chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and unlock further objectives. But once you use that 1 assist skip, it's gone. You can't assist skip anything anymore. And so it sort of becomes a puzzle. What chapter do I skip? That's not always an easy question. Plenty of very advanced Bingo players struggle with that question. So...
And yes, for all of you...
Don't worry if you're a little confused.
Yeah. For all of you entrenched Celeste Bingo players out there, you can skip Summit to get to Epilogue.
Okay, fine. Yes, you can skip Summit to get to Epilogue. There is one objective in Epilogue, and it's usually not worth sacrificing your assist skip for one objective. But if you really wanted to,
Yep.
I suppose you could.
Yeah. And then there are just a few more rules that go into Celeste Lockout in particular. You are not allowed to skip the intro cutscenes in Prologue. That basically just gives both players about a minute to read the board, see what's going on before they need to jump straight into City.
Yeah. Sort of in the vein of that, usually when we count players down in Bingo Sync, there's a countdown from 5 to reveal the board. And both players reveal the board and sometimes make sure that they're seeing the same board because Bingo Sync is admittedly sometimes a little bit buggy, but we do what we manage.
Yeah.
And then after that countdown, there's a separate countdown from 5 for the players to start playing the game. And then they enter Prologue, look at the board as they don't skip the cutscenes, and then, well, the race is on.
Yeah. All right. So probably moving on. Probably the most commonly asked question that I get from people who have never played bingo, other than what is bingo, is what do I need to know to get into bingo? And the real answer to that is you can start playing without like intimate knowledge of everything in the game, but there are some things that show up on the bingo boards that are important to at least be aware of.
Yeah. So let's talk about what shows up, well, in the sense of what doesn't show up. Well, you can absolutely get anything from all of the A sides, chapter 1 all the way up to chapter 8. You can sometimes see any of the first 7 B sides, all the way up from City B all the way to Summit B, and you can get some chapter 9, but it only goes up to around a third of the way through the chapter at Event Horizon. After that, you won't see any more chapter 9 objectives. And so if you really want to know what shows up in bingo, the answer is everything up until that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, having said that, of course, some of those things are slightly more common than others, but
Yeah.
the point is that anything in that range, including all the berries, all the collectibles, like blue hats, cassettes, cutscenes, gems and Summit, keys, even, all of that can appear.
Yeah. And so while it's good to be prepared and not be jump scared by any particular type of objective, the real answer is outside of C-sides and outside of the core B-side and late farewell, anything is fair game.
Yeah.
And I mean everything. We have grabless checkpoints in A-sides. We have the intro car in farewell. We have objectives in the Pico 8 console in the Celestial Resort. We have objectives for doing things like killing seekers, winged golden berry, random binoculars, the whole gamut.
Yeah, I mean, stunning enemies, stunning Oshiro, jumping on snowballs, anything.
Mhm.
Absolutely anything goes in this game. And so, while I can't say, while I can tell you everything that could appear, I definitely can't advise you to walk into your first bingo card knowing how to do everything on the board, because that's a lot of stuff to prepare.
Yeah, and I also recommend, again, just looking at the entire list of objectives and making sure that you can do all of them, because it's boring. Just play games and you'll figure it out.
Yep. I mean, believe me, we've had times both in like live games and in actually streamed games on Celeste community where players didn't know how to do objectives, and trust me, it's all fun. It's very enjoyable, both to watch and, well, a little bit to play.
Yeah.
It's a little infuriating too. Trust me, we've had races where players try to do one very specific objective, namely intro Colin remembered, for upwards of 15 minutes. It's great.
And it's at this point that I kind of want to interject and talk about one of the main things that are stopping people from trying out bingo. And that thing, which I've noticed a lot of, is gatekeeping. But not gatekeeping from the Celeste community, we're actually, a pretty nice bunch. Uh,
I hope so.
but it's a lot of self gatekeeping. There's a lot of people saying to themselves, I don't want to try out bingo because I don't think I'd be good at it and I'm gonna lose. And that kind of like perception, A, is really common in the Celeste community. And B
Yeah.
is the number one reason why people don't try it because they're like concerned about how they do. And I can guarantee that bingo is all for fun. It is fun. It's for fun
Yeah.
and it is fun. And nobody's gonna hold it against you if you don't know how to do grapless hollows.
Yeah, exactly. Like, believe me, none of us are going to laugh. Well, okay, we might laugh at you a little bit, but none of us are going to laugh at you in a mean-spirited way. I mean, at the end of the day, just take a stab at it.
Yeah,
And hey, you might surprise yourself even. And if you don't, well, you're probably going to end up learning and getting better as you play. I mean, it's just an experience that I don't know. Give it a shot. Why
yeah.
not?
Like it says in Celeste, like be proud of your death count. We're proud of our lockout loss count here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would be shocked if I haven't lost hundreds of games at this point.
Yeah,
It's yeah, I mean, I've been playing bingo for a while, and believe me, losses come with the territory all the time. And oftentimes it's just as fun to lose as it is to win.
oh yeah,
So give it a whirl. You might lose, but that's okay. You'll get better.
yeah. So although I do respect that many people want to prepare as much as possible before their first bingo game. So while my general advice would be just take a stab at it, what would you say, Ree, are the things that are most important to practice before someone's first lockout game?
Alright. So if you want to talk about the stuff that you're most likely going to be seeing, you could absolutely see any of the first 5A sides, so chapters 1 to 5A. Pretty much anything in them could show up, but just knowing how to play them fast is pretty useful in bingo. As is maybe the start of chapter 6 and the start of chapter 7, just like the first couple of checkpoints each. Of course, anything in those chapters can appear in bingo, but they aren't. But later stuff in those chapters is slightly less common. As far as B-sides go, 1B, 2B, and 5B, I think, are the most important B-sides. 5B being, of course, the any percent B-side. But yeah, those three usually show up most frequently, though again, anything can show up. But yeah, I would recommend those chapters if you want to know, like, if you want to have some modicum of preparation before going into your first bingo game, learning those chapters is probably enough.
Yeah, and then it is worth mentioning that you shouldn't be caught off guard by harder challenge objectives like Winged Golden. Obviously, like not everyone has experience with everything, at least going into bingo. But if you're concerned about specific things, you know, it's worth practicing.
Yeah. Um, I mean, obviously, as you get into a game and play more bingo, you can identify weaknesses as you play and just get better at them.
Yep.
So again, despite this, don't feel afraid to jump into it.
Yeah.
And the other reason we're sort of pushing new bingo players to just play a game is because despite a lot of preparation, uh, most of your actual bingo skill doesn't come from how fast you push the buttons.
Yeah.
It comes from routing, which is to say, picking what of those 25 objectives you want to go for first, what you want to go for second, guessing where your opponent is. I mean, there's just layers upon layers of strategy here that we're going to talk about a little bit, but more importantly, I mean, we're going to talk about that a little bit, but it's something that you just sort of learn for yourself with lots of practice.
Yeah.
Uh,
It definitely bears repeating that execution by itself is not super important to bingo. Like obviously, uh, races happen and execution checks, as we call them, happen. But if you die a few times in City, like the game's not over. You don't need to reset. So fighting against speedrunner brain is kind of important when it comes to Lockout. But and a lot of people beat themselves up about losing races. But I mean, if I'm gonna toot my own horn for a second, I would put myself in the top end of expert Lockout players, and my execution is like, you know, not top end.
Yeah, I mean, I would put myself in probably the low end of the expert category. Well, and I would say my own execution is like not particularly great. I just have plenty of bingo experience and routing. Again, sort of why I'm in this podcast with Clab, because both of us know the game and love the game.
Yeah, we're huge nerds about it.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Uh,
yeah, like the most important thing to take away from it is uh bingo's for all execution levels. Because it's mostly a brain game, not a fingers game. And don't gatekeep yourself out of it. I'm gonna keep saying that.
yeah, absolutely. That being said, we mentioned something about being expert level. If you want to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So in the Celeste Discord, or the Celeste Bingo Discord, I should say, also known as the Celeste Community Events Discord server, we have self-assignable skill roles, and the main important thing about that is that they are self-assignable. You're allowed to choose what skill level think describes you the best, ping others of that skill level to get games with people that are approximately about as comfortable as you with Lockout. We do have 4 skill level roles: beginner, intermediate, advanced, and expert. And we have events like streamed tournaments for all 4 of those skill levels. So if you're a beginner and you want to, you know, be restreamed on a Celeste community event, uh, you're in luck.
Yeah, absolutely. We usually go through those sorts of things on a cycle every give or take 3 months or so.
Yeah.
I will say that with the slight addendum that obviously Celeste community is involved in a bunch of things that aren't bingo, so who knows how consistent that cycle actually is.
Yeah.
But there will be a beginner tournament coming up sometime relatively soon, considering we just finished the cycle with the expert tournament.
Yeah. At time of recording, we are currently in between the previous cycle ending with expert and the next cycle beginning with beginner. Right now, we in between these cycles, we always prepare some intermediate or not intermediate intermediary events. Currently, that's the Benny Percent battle and one other thing which I will keep tight-lipped about. But we usually have these events every 3 weeks or so. 4 of those events by 3 weeks is like 3 months, and we have 2 or 3 of those cycles a year.
Well, now I know what this. Now I want to know what this one other thing is that you claim to be tight-lipped about. I actually don't know. Well, okay, all right. In any case, yeah, feel free to hop into the Bingo Community Discord anytime you want. Give yourself the beginner skill roll, and ping the beginner category and see if you get a game or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, that being said, we do have like defined skill rolls, but don't be afraid to play outside your skill roll. In fact, just don't be afraid to play.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, like the way to learn bingo and to improve at bingo is by pushing yourself, and oftentimes that means losing. So don't be afraid to lose.
Yeah. Like pinging up to the next skill level is probably one of the best things that you can do to learn about routing. See what your opponent does that works, maybe what they do or what you do that doesn't work, and use that to improve your routing.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, speaking of routing.
Yeah, so we've danced around this topic a bit, but we've said basically that the Celeste like lockout bingo sphere is very much rich in terms of how you can approach the board, um, and what routes you can take, And so I think it's worth it to put a little bit of time into just talking about that. But before we do, let's talk about a couple things let's talk about a couple terms that we might end up using while talking about routing, namely those being early game, mid game, and late game. So usually a game is sort of divided into three segments. The early game being that first initial rush when players are going into chapters 1 and 2 and they're looking at the boards and they're racing for objectives as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And the thing about this period is that it's simultaneously important to get objectives as it is to unlock more chapters and get access to more objectives.
Yeah, so we'll be
Yeah.
talking more about progress versus objectives soon.
Mhm.
But early game is kind of the part of the game that tends to be most similar between every board. You know, on 95% of boards, both players will be playing the first chapter and the second chapter, in succession, mostly just working through them, maybe getting some objectives on the side, but most of the effort is unlocking chapters 3, 4, and 5, which is where the bulk of the super important objectives are.
Yeah. And then we get into the mid game, which usually takes place around in chapters 3, 4, and 5. There's usually two main ways a mid game can go. Either the players follow a pretty similar route through the same chapters, or they take different routes through chapters 3, 4, and 5, again, utilizing that assist skip, sometimes on chapter 3, and sometimes not on chapter 3. Um, and so we usually call this time of the game where the players sometimes choose different routes as the mid game.
Yeah,
But again, during this time, both players are still trying to complete these chapters and gain access to more of the board.
yeah. Mid game we usually talk about is like the planning phase, where well maybe less of the planning phase and more of the setup phase for your route. It's where routes start to diverge more. Players can skip different chapters. 3, 4, or 5 are all the most commonly skipped chapters, and it there are some important objectives, but there's also a lot of setup for the late game, which is where routes tend to diverge the most.
Mm-hmm. And then late game is usually that point when players are done with their respective chapters, and they sort of look at the board and they either try to complete things they've sort of been subtly working towards, or they work towards different things, towards different objectives. Really, the board just opens up for both of these players, and it's at this point that players try to cash in on their synergies, maybe try to guess what their opponents are doing, maybe steal some objectives if they can. It is really where some of the most rich and some of the most intense routing of Lockout comes into play. And it's also sometimes where the most exciting stuff happens because the board is opened up. There's so many options. What are the players going to do? How are they going to choose things? And so sometimes late game will be in chapter 6 or chapter 7. Sometimes it'll be going back to earlier chapters to grab dailies or B-sides or whatever that was skipped earlier. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and obviously these neat little boxes don't apply to every single game. Sometimes mid game takes place in 4B into farewell, and sometimes late game is a rush to get 5B sides, or Pico 8 objectives, or whatever.
And then every once in a while, a player walks in, upends the script, and says, "Okay, I'm skipping chapter 1 or chapter 2, cutting my early game short."
Yep.
And the board pretty much immediately devolves into mid game, and it's just wow.
And this is what makes
Believe me.
makes bingo so exciting, because anything can happen, really.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about the bingo meta, side note, when we talk about the bingo meta, we're just talking about things that most commonly happen, but there's always a little asterisk that at least one player has done something weird at some point.
Believe me. And if there isn't an asterisk, someone will make that asterisk.
Yeah.
Is more or less how it happens in the bingo community. believe me, I've tried to make a list of all the routes that I've seen in Bingo, and I had to abandon that project because people kept doing different things
Yep.
that weren't on my list. It
It's
was
so impossible
infuriating.
to do that. All right.
Yeah,
So the first step when it comes to routing, is making a plan for how you think the game is gonna go. And the best time to do that, obviously, is in prologue because it's prologue. It's an auto scroller.
yep,
And you have a minute of opportunity to take a look at the board and identify objectives that you think are the most important.
yep. Again, prologue cutscenes aren't skippable, so players usually work their way into a cutscene, mash their A button or their confirm button or whatever button they use, and then stare at the board. And while they're looking for a couple things. They're looking, most importantly, to find out where objectives are most concentrated and what they should go for first.
Yeah, so this is kind of a time for general impressions. Looking at the board, if you see six berry objectives, you can think to yourself, okay, maybe it would be strong to get berries along the way as I play these chapters. Or maybe not. Maybe if you see a lot of heart synergy, you can think maybe I'll play B-sides first pass, or maybe not. So it becomes kind of a mind games trying to see what you think you should do, what your opponent might end up doing, and what you should do based on that.
Yeah. I mean, again, you only get a minute in prologue, which, as most bingo players can attest, is not enough time to do everything.
Yeah, we could
You
spend an
definitely,
hour analyzing every board.
yeah, you definitely can't like remember or memorize all 25 objectives, and you probably can't plan out how the late game is going to turn out because, well, that's just so tough to do. But if you can see some potential synergies to work towards, synergies that is being objectives um that work towards each other, like 25 berries and 50 berries, those two objectives work towards each other. In that getting one is useful towards getting the other. So yeah, if you can identify any of those, or if you can identify, hey, there's a lot of stuff in chapter 3, maybe I want to play chapter 3 and skip chapter, I don't know, 5 or something. That's the sort of stuff you end up doing in prologue.
Yeah, but it is worth mentioning that the plan that you set for yourself in prologue has about a 100% chance of being disrupted at some point. So it's also really important not to uh, follow your script for the game super closely and be willing to experiment, follow your gut, mix up your route halfway through the game, and play based on what your opponent does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it happens all of the time that I lead a board in prologue, think, okay, I'm doing this, and then I play through half of chapter 1, and then I go, wait, no, I shouldn't do this anymore. And then my opponent takes off something, and I'm like, wait, no, I absolutely should have done that.
Yep,
It's great.
it's awesome. It's what I live for in bingo. The fast paced decision making, and yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, after prologue, there's nothing is an auto scroller. So either you've got to think as you play, which is very difficult, or you've got to like actually sit down, stop playing, and think,
Which is
which
bad.
that's time loss. You don't want to do that. Don't do that. And so you really have to make decisions on the fly.
Yeah, and so some of those decisions that you might make, uh, is what should I do right now? Should I go for objectives or should I complete chapters to get access to more objectives? And
Right.
this dichotomy between progress and objectives is more or less the core question that every router needs to ask themselves as they play. It's like the defining characteristic of bingo.
Yeah. As you play a little bit of bingo, you gain some sort of intuition for what objectives are quick and what objectives are early, what objectives you can do really quickly. So, for example, all collectibles in 1A, that's an objective which is not particularly quick. It'll take 2, 3, 4 minutes to do, but it's very early. You can access it because it's 1A, it's the first chapter. And so bingo players have to ask themselves, do I want to go for that at the start? Or do I want to play a couple of chapters, play 1A, 2A, maybe skip 3A or something, so that I can access a later objective that is harder to get to. It's later in the game, but it takes less time to do. Maybe only a couple seconds.
And it is worth mentioning that in all of my time playing Bingo, I have never seen First Pass All Collectibles 1A. Because even though it is an objective, and it is right at the beginning, it is never worth going for at the beginning, because those minutes in the early game are so valuable. Like,
Yeah.
A really important highlight is Talk to Theo in Crossing, which is one of the easiest objectives and one of the fastest objectives in the game, is often skipped in the beginning, even though it only loses 10 seconds, because being 10 seconds behind into Old Site can make or break your route.
I think Theo in Crossing loses a little more. It's a little more like 20.
Okay.
But even that 20 seconds into Old Site, that can make or break a route, because objectives later on take less than 20 seconds. And so you've got to weigh that time against each other. It's sort of funny how we talk about that dichotomy of execution not mattering versus every objective mattering, but this is what Celeste routing is about. It's being able to make those quick routing decisions to offset bad execution sometimes.
Yeah, like, for example, if, I don't know, 3 winged berries is on the board. You can finish that in Old Site by getting the 2 winged berries in 1A and the winged berry in Awake at the end of 2A. If that's on the board and you have some bad execution in Old Site, you think, okay, I'm gonna skip the Awake berry to try to recoup some of this progress. I'm okay with my opponent stealing this objective, and maybe I will end up being ahead into 4A, which might end up mattering more.
It's very feel-based at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's intuitive, and it's something that mostly comes with practice. Having said that, there are some things we can talk about for sort of deciding how much objectives are worth on a board. And so this is a term, again, it's very instinctual, but we like to call it objective economy, which, I mean, if you're an advanced bingo player and you just heard that and you go, what the heck is objective economy? I've literally never heard of that. That's okay.
Yeah.
Because it's, again, probably something you know without realizing that you know.
Yeah.
And so the objective economy on a board is sort of a metric of how much objectives are worth on a board, how fast objectives are, how quick they are to do,
and also loosely how much synergy exists on a board. So kind of a good way of visualizing it is looking at a board and thinking, okay, if Talk to Theo in Crossing was on this board, would I want to go for it first pass? If you don't want to go for it first pass, that probably means that objectives on the board generally are pretty quick or are easily rushable. Things like common culprits that come to mind are Grabless start of 4A, get Theo's phone in 5A, complete 3 A-sides. These are things that you can get pretty easily on the way, are very fast to get, and would make the 20-second time loss for Talk to Theo in Crossing not worth it. But if the board is full of things like Grabless 6A, all collectibles in 8A, like 5 A-sides, you might want to get that Talk to Theo in Crossing, because getting that one objective early on is worth the 20-second time loss.
I mean, it's sometimes, I mean, the thing is, it's worth it to note that bingo does not guarantee a balance of some fast objectives and some slow objectives. You could absolutely walk into a board that, I mean, bingo does guarantee a balance of some early objectives and some late objectives, but you could walk into a board where your early objectives are things like dashless crossing, which is very slow, or all berries instead of 3A. There are 11 of them. They take like an extra minute and a half. It's very much not worth it to go for them.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes when you see those sorts of objectives on a board that are early but don't have good synergy, or they just take a long time that they wouldn't be worth doing first pass, you can look at that and say, okay, the objective economy on on this board is sort of low, I want an objective now. I think it's worth it to lose 20 seconds of progress and grab this one objective because I don't think my opponent can do something meaningful with those extra 20 seconds.
Yeah. And the other really important part about understanding objective economy is kind of realizing what your opponent's feel of what objective economy might be, because it's entirely possible that you and your opponent read the board differently and identify different important parts of the board. So watching how your opponent reacts to the board is super, super, super important, because knowing what your opponent's doing can influence your route, but more importantly, change what what you think is most important in a game. And that's a lot of like word salad. So the gist of it is knowing what your opponent's doing is the number one way to prevent them from getting out of hand and to keep the game winnable for you.
Right. Sometimes in a bingo game, you commit to something decently early, and you find that you're behind in progress, and your opponent can just clean up lots of things for free, and so they play, I don't know, 4A set, and then 4A Shrine, and then Ord Trail, and then Cliff Face, and suddenly your game has turned into a snowball where your opponent is just so far ahead of you. And so it's important to remember that as you play that early game, like, you have to not let your opponent get out of hand.
Yeah.
And the thing about bingo is that at the end of the day, even if you're behind a little bit at the start, you can oftentimes still win in the mid game or the late game. You can route better. We've seen comebacks from places as dire as 6 objectives to 1.
Yeah.
So don't let it get to you if you're behind
And
at the start.
If you're interested in watching a game that visualizes this exact thing very well, you should check out our previous episode of First to 13, where we went over the expert bench that was recently hosted at GDQ Hotfix, specifically the second game that we cover between Vapo and Vernal.
Yeah. Not to spoil the match if you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
But one player gets off to a very strong lead, and it becomes a battle of the ages for the other expert player to come back.
Very, very good stuff.
Yeah, and that's at the expert level,
yeah,
where players are really, really fast. So compare that to the beginner, the intermediate, the advanced level, where players are slightly slower, and I mean, this just gets a little bit exacerbated in the sense that you can absolutely come back from ugly positions.
Yeah. And, okay, and on the topic of knowing what your opponent is doing, let's talk a little bit about assist skips. Assist skips are the number one way to influence your opponent's route as well as your own route. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, let's say you think you're behind exiting old site, and there's some objectives in 3A, and there's also some objectives in 4A. You may know that 3A is much longer than 4A. So you may think, okay, I think my opponent is going to skip 3A and go to 4A because there's the same amount of objectives in that chapter, but that chapter's faster. But since I'm behind, I should play 3A because my progress is already behind. I don't mind if my progress gets worse, and I might be able to do an upset if I do something unexpected. That's one of the ways that assist skips can play a really heavy role into routing.
Yeah, exactly. And well, it should be noted that assist skips, more often than not, I'll say, maybe not all the time, but more often than not, they're used on 3A. Because 3A is the longest early game chapter. It's more than twice as long as Chapter 1 or Chapter 2. It's even slightly longer than Chapter 4, and it's of a comparable length to Chapter 5.
Yeah.
But since 3A is so early, a lot of players oftentimes skip Chapter 3 in order to access Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 quicker, because those chapters oftentimes have a lot of objectives. And so playing 3A sometimes when you're not expected to, because it's not like the perfect optimal play, and then saving your assist skip for a later day is, again, oftentimes a way to come back from an ugly position.
Yeah. The assist skip is just super, super, super important. And the question that you mentioned of should I skip 3A is usually the first question that players ask themselves when they're looking at a board. Because that's, if there was one routing decision that I would say is most common, it's the decision to either skip or not skip 3A.
Yeah.
And I mean, illustrating that, if you play 3A, and then you're like, okay, I need to get to late game. You play 4A, for 3 minutes or whatever. You skip Temple, and suddenly you're in Summit. You just went from 3A to Summit in 2 minutes.
Yep. Which is weird to think about, but yeah, you can absolutely contest late game from 3A.
Yep.
That's the thing. Yeah, so usually you look at the board to figure out whether or not you're assist skipping 3A in Prologue. Sometimes you don't, sometimes you just wing it. I recommend trying to figure it out, and if you don't, well, you'll figure it out at some point.
Yeah.
Probably when you're sitting on the menu right in front of 3A.
Yeah. And like there's so much that we could talk about for assist skips. We could probably make an entire episode. So
Yeah.
Like
I think we won't belabor these points too hard, but
yeah.
deciding where to use your assist skip is difficult. Sometimes do it on 3A.
Yeah. For beginners, I would recommend the decision of whether or not to skip 3A is the most important thing to focus on, and then for everything else, follow your heart.
Yep. Don't skip 1A if you're a beginner.
Yeah, please don't. I mean,
Yes.
people will love you, but you'll lose.
And although we did just say that bingo is for fun, you trust me, losing within the first 4 minutes of the game is not as much fun as you might expect.
Yeah. So some other thing about routing that we actually brought up earlier is the idea of synergy. And I know we talked about it earlier, but it's good to give like a rigorous definition of what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So synergy on a board is a way that you can shape your route to be more efficient. For example, if your route has several berry things, that is going to be more efficient than if your route has a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the Celeste bingo generator is built for synergy. It's not built like bingo is in some games, I don't know, Super Mario Sunshine or whatever, where objectives are like required to be in different places. In Celeste Lockout Bingo, a lot of objectives are built so that you can sort of do them anywhere. Something like 15 berries in 3 chapters. You could do that anywhere. Or something like 65 berries. You could do that anywhere. Complete 3 B-sides. It doesn't need to be a specific B-side, but you can just do that in whichever 3 B-sides you like. And so recognizing these objectives and working them into your route as you play, and being able to claim a lead towards these objectives by taking off other things is tough to do, but it's also sometimes very useful.
Yeah. And it's really important to be able to recognize synergy on a board because it can change your early game routing, as well as obviously your mid game and late game routing. An illustration that I like to use is if old site B side is on the board and you're thinking about whether or not you want to play it first pass, most of the time you'd say, 2A is faster. I don't want to play 2B. But if, for example, complete 2 B-sides is on the board, suddenly old site B-side looks a lot more appealing.
Yeah, exactly. And so being able to and furthermore, once you tick off that old site B-side, remember the only information that your opponent ever gets is based on what you tick. So when you tick off old site B-side, you also indicate that you are steadily pursuing those B-side objectives.
Or maybe not.
or maybe not. And so knowing that your opponent, okay, and so your opponent might think, okay, they ticked off wood side B-side. I'm just not going to go for any more B-sides because I don't think I'm going to win them because I'm behind in them. And then you might think, okay, my opponent is going to think that, and so I'm just going to avoid completing my B-side synergy for like half the game.
Yep.
And you do. And it's mind games the whole way down.
Yeah,
It's great.
sometimes your opponent can call your bluff and be like, okay, I'm gonna do two B-sides. Sometimes your opponent is gonna be like, okay, I see what you're doing. I'm going to do something wild and wacky so that you are unable to finish your second B-side because you need to address what I'm doing. There's a million ways that synergy can kind of explode out into 15 different ways that a board could be played.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So yeah. So we've mostly been talking about things like leading the board and synergy that apply a lot of the time to what happens in the early game and what happens in the mid game. But let's also talk about the late game a little bit. In the late game, your main goal is to find a win condition, which is to say, to like knowing your own score, to find a group of objectives that you can realistically get, maybe before your opponents, that gets you to that magical 13 objective number. We call that finding a win condition. Sometimes we call it counting to 13. It's not easy to do, but if you can find a win condition early and you can work exactly towards that win condition, sometimes you have to be a little bit adaptable, but if you can work towards that win condition of 13 objectives before your opponent is able to do anything about it, well, then you just win the game.
Yeah. And once again, I'm going to recommend watching our previous podcast because both of these games, we talk a lot about counting to 13 and the routing that goes into it. But something else that's important about counting to 13, aside from deciding how you think you'll be able to get to 13, it's important to know how you think your opponent is going to try to get to 13. For example, if you both have 9 objectives, both of you need 4 objectives to win. By definition, since there's only 25 objectives, at least one of those objectives, both of you are going to want to be going for. And that objective is the most important objective.
Yeah, that contested objective that's being looked towards for both sides, sometimes that's what you want to rush for first. Yeah. Sometimes you want to leave it, do something else, and then rush for a different objective that your opponent wasn't expecting you to get.
So if both players like randomly quit out of what they're doing and start like playing, I don't know, like Groundless 2A or something, that's usually what's happening.
Yeah. It's usually both players looking, okay, wait, I just realized this objective is both in my win condition and my opponent's most likely one. Of course, I don't know what they're thinking, but I can see their ticks and I can see where their synergy builds to, so I can maybe guess what they want to do. And this objective is crucial for both of us, so I've got to go do it now. And they quit out and go do it now. And then we have a race.
Yep.
Which is always very exciting.
Yeah, and those kinds of races are, the craziest parts of bingo, but it's also the most strategically involved part of bingo, because you're kind of making a gamble, saying like, okay, I don't think my opponent is ahead of me doing this, and I think that the risk of doing something miscellaneous right now is not outweighed by the reward of potentially winning the game.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So, in the end, at the end of the day, late game is basically that point where you've got to look to 13 both for yourself and for your opponent.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you see your opponent has an easy path to 13, so for example, say your opponent has 9 objectives, and 3A, which both of you have skipped near the start of the game, has full objectives in it. Well, because 3A has full objectives in it, no matter how many objectives you have, even if there's like something really juicy, really quick, and really tantalizing to look forward to in a different chapter, you basically have to head into 3A and try to steal something from your opponent, or else they can just walk into 3A, get 3 things and win.
Yep.
I mean, get 4 things and win.
Yeah. I'm gonna repeat that because this is one of the highest concept bingo routing ideas, except for delays, which will definitely be an episode by itself.
Yes.
But I'm going to repeat what you just said because it's so important. If it's 9-9 and there's 4 objectives in 3A, to win the game, you need at least 1 objective in 3A. It is 100% required because there's only 7 objectives left. If you get all 3 of the non-3A objectives, you still need at least 1 in 3A. So, if your opponent gets all 4 of the 3 objectives or are ahead of you into 3A and are able to get all of them, then you just lose. No matter how much progress you have to the other 3 objectives.
Yeah. And so you have to walk into 3A and steal at least 1 objective. But there's oftentimes a little bit of decision making that goes into what objective do I steal? Like, say that the objectives in 3A are something along the lines of Glabless Huge Mess, 5 Berries in Pico 8, Glabless plus Denture Suite, and Blue and Red Hut and Celestial Isolate. Huge Mess, the middle checkpoint of 3A, if you think you're behind of your opponent into 3A, and there's 4 things there, you can skip some of the early things in 3A and gun something late, like Blue and Red Hut and Celestial Isolate, and maybe win just that one thing, and all of a sudden 3A is no longer a win condition for your opponent. And suddenly you can win off of those 3 extra things. But you have to do something.
Yeah. And maybe getting those early objectives would make more sense because they are shorter than completing 3 B-side. It would be more risky because your opponent could pick them off at any time. But it's always the time investment versus the potential risk of being locked out against the reward of potentially turning the game over for your opponent.
Yeah. So in that case, I think the last thing I want to say here is that when conditions are difficult, counting to 13 is not nearly as easy as we are making it out to be, I think.
Like one of the working titles for this podcast was "Counting is Hard."
Yeah, because it is so very difficult to find a way to 13 objectives and also guess things and also make accurate predictions as to where your opponent is. And we haven't even talked about delays, which is arguably the most meta aspect of modern bingo. And the reason we're not talking about it is because, well, it's probably not very suitable for someone who's just getting into bingo.
Yeah.
Because delays are extremely difficult to do.
Yep. Yeah. So I mean, the best advice I can give to someone who just heard this hour-long info dump is number 1, don't be afraid to play, because all of this might seem very intimidating, but as you play and as you practice, things become more natural and clear very quickly, I might add. And 2, don't be afraid to ask questions, because Reed and I are always willing to nerd out about bingo. If you're confused about anything, like we've got a pretty chill group in the bingo court. So I promise we are not gatekeeping. The only gatekeeping you need to fear is from yourself.
Yeah. So join, ask anyone questions. Doesn't have to be me or Clab. Pretty much everyone in the Celeste community. I like to think that we're a pretty chill community.
Yeah.
That the bingo community is pretty much always willing to help out new people. So don't be afraid to join.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to play. Don't be afraid to lose. You'll learn, and don't be afraid to lose. You'll learn as you lose, and yeah, just give it a shot.
Yep. And one last thing I'm going to add is if you want to join within the next few months, you will 100% be allowed and in fact encouraged to join the next beginner bingo binge, which is the beginner level tournament that is part of the cycle that we mentioned earlier. It'll be happening sometime in the early fall. Obviously all beginners, including beginners, are welcome.
Yep. And so I think with that, I think we've covered most of what we wanted to talk about for this podcast.
Yeah, so
Unless you have something more to say.
I think that's everything that we wanted. Yeah. So thanks so much for joining us. We've been Crab and Reed. As always, links to everything that we talked about will be in the description. And yeah, join us next week when we will be talking about more bingo stuff.
Yeah. See ya.
Bye.